All right, we're going to talk about landing men on the moon. To this day, this is still the greatest technological achievement that mankind has ever done. And there has only been 12 men that have ever stepped on a body other than Earth. Those 12 men went to the moon. All right, so let's talk about how this occurred and when it occurred. So you got to remember the history of this, and you've probably heard this if you've ever been to the Houston Space Center and all that, but it goes all the way back to 1957. 1957, we had already started the Cold War. World War II was over. We had nuclear bombs. Russians had nuclear bombs. We didn't trust them. They didn't trust us. And we were starting space exploration, which actually goes back to World War II because the Germans had been using rockets. And they were using rockets that they were sending at London and other places. And so they had the best rocket scientists in the world. A guy named Wernher von Braun, who was the rocket scientist for the Germans. Well, when the Germans lost World War II, what happened was the rocket engineers said, okay, are we going to become a Russian or are we going to become US? Because the Russians were coming from the eastern side, we were coming from the western side. Wernher von Braun decided he wanted to go to the US. He came to us. We allowed him. He actually set up our rocket program after working for the Germans during World War II. And then the Russians took some of the other engineers. So the rocket engineers kind of split. Half of them went to the Russians, half of them went to the United States. Okay? And then the Russians in 1957 launched Sputnik 1, which was the first satellite to go into orbit. And this scared the US totally, because if you can launch something that goes in orbit, it flew right over the United States, you could go outside, everybody could go outside and watch the satellite go over. They're like, oh, well, they could put a nuclear bomb on it and then drop it anywhere they want on the US. None of this before. You had to take your invading force and everybody would see it coming way in advance. And so that was when they decided, oh, we need to do something about it. And we started our rocket program. NASA started. It wasn't NASA at the first, but then they changed it into NASA. And in the 1960s then, it was kind of a who has the most dominant program. And that was when Kennedy was in office, John F. Kennedy, and I think it was Khrushchev was in the Russian, and they were kind of, it was Cold War, and it was like, okay, we're going to outdo you kind of thing. And that's when John F. Kennedy made his famous speech in the early 1960s, when he said, we will send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within this decade. The key was within this decade, because they wanted to make sure that was true. This was the 1960s, so NASA was trying to do this by 1969, before it turned to 1970. And so that began what they called the space race. Now you don't just launch a man to the moon. In fact, we were, at the time when he said that, we had barely got people in orbit. John Glenn and some of those guys that orbited the Earth, that was about it. It's a long way from the Earth to the moon. And a lot of things had to be overcome. So, this is how you get to the moon, or this is how they did it back then. There are multiple ways. But here's the Earth, here's the moon. Okay? So when you launch up from the Earth, you don't just launch straight to the moon. The hardest part about launching a rocket is getting off the Earth, because we have a lot of gravity. And so you have to get a lot of energy. You have to get up to like 18,000, 19,000 miles an hour to escape the Earth's orbit. You have to get up to about 16,000, 17,000 just to put it in orbit, and then you have to gain another few thousand miles per hour to escape Earth's gravity and make it to the moon. And so to do that, you needed a really big rocket. So the rockets they built were these rockets here. These were the Saturn V rockets. And this was the culmination of the race to the moon. They started with smaller rockets. They had the Mercury program, then they went to the Gemini program, which was 2 guys. And then they finally got to the Apollo, which was launching 3 men to the moon. And so what they did was, these rockets are huge, and there's still 3 of them that exist. I've seen all 3 of them. They're all in museums now. If you go down to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, south of Houston, they have one in a building there, and it's hanging in this huge building, and you can walk underneath it and see it. There's also one in Alabama, where they have the Space Center there where they build rockets. That was one of the places that built rockets. And there's one in Florida. at the Kennedy Space Center. So that's where they all are. These rockets were amazing. I mean, as far as power and everything, the space shuttle only came up to about this high nowadays. So it's not nearly as big as these rockets are. Very large rocket. They're also the most successful rockets. These rockets never fail. Not once did these rockets fail. Okay? But how they worked was, they had these massive engines, 4 massive engines on here, and then that was just to barely get them going off the Earth. So you would launch from the Earth, and you would always launch in the direction that the Earth is spinning. Okay? So in our case, we're launching to the east because that's the way the Earth is spinning. Okay? I kind of do this backwards here, but so if we do it with the North Pole up, the Earth is actually spinning this way, right? So when we launch them, we would launch it in the same direction because then you already have a little boost because you get the boost from the spinning of the Earth. You can get into orbit faster. So from Florida, they always launch it to the east. 2 reasons for that. It gets a boost, it goes faster. Second thing is if something goes wrong and the rocket breaks up or something, it falls into the ocean, doesn't hurt anybody. So all this giant rocket right here was to launch them off the launch pad. So this gets them off the launch pad. Then they get up about 20, 30 miles high. This part falls off. It falls back down and actually falls back down in the ocean. They can recover this and get it back. Okay? That part comes off. Then they're trying to get in orbit. They haven't got fast enough to even get in orbit. And the second stage just kicks on here. And so the second stage kicks off, and that gets them up into just about out of the atmosphere. It falls off. It has its 5 engines on the bottom. It falls off back to the Earth. Then this last part shoots them off. This falls off right away. This was actually just for the launch to get them up out through the atmosphere. And then they're going like this, and this puts them up into orbit. Then the last stage here falls off as they get up into orbit. So my model here. So all this whole thing is just to get them into Earth's orbit. Huge, massive rocket. Right? Millions of tons of thrust just to get them in orbit. Once they get into orbit, these parts pop out. See if this works here. And this part falls back into the atmosphere and actually burns up. And we lose that part. Then you have these 2 pieces which are floating around the moon. I mean the moon, the Earth, in Earth's orbit. Then they maneuver the command module, they take it out, they rotate it around, they bring it down, and they connect it together to the lunar excursion module. Okay? And then this orbits the Earth. Okay? And this orbits the Earth for a while until they get the right configuration. So all of that huge rocket was to put these 2 pieces into, this is called the command module and the lunar excursion module, into orbit around the Earth. And then when they get into the right configuration, when they're about here, they burn the rocket on the command module, this one rocket here. But when you're already in orbit, you just have to boost that a little bit to get out of the Earth's gravitational field. So they boost the orbit and they start flying towards the moon, like this. Okay? Now, if you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, this is where things went wrong for Apollo 13. Is as they were on the way to the moon, they stirred their oxygen tank. They have 2 oxygen tanks. The oxygen tanks not only give them something to breathe, all right, but they also are used for power. They would convert the oxygen with hydrogen in what they call a fuel cell, which people are using hydrogen cars now, which is the fuel cell car. NASA was doing this back in the 60s. So they act like it's new technology. It's like, no, this hasn't been around a long time. They were using it way back then. Well, the problem with Apollo 13 is one of those oxygen tanks, when they stirred it, blew up. There was a flaw in the tank, it blew up, and it blew a hole in the second one. And they were in big trouble, because they just blew out both of their oxygen tanks, no oxygen left, and they're going at 20,000 miles per hour towards the moon. You can't just stop and turn around. And so they realized for Apollo 13 that their only hope to saving these guys was to actually go around the moon and come back and let the moon slingshot them back. What saved them is they had the lunar excursion module, which was supposed to land on the moon, and it had oxygen and supplies for 2 guys for a couple of, about 2 days worth, which is all the longer that they were supposed to be there. So all 3 of them crammed in there until they came around the moon and had to come back again. All right, but let's get back to Apollo 11. I'm just telling you that because that's what happened to Apollo 13. They never landed, and then they came back again. If you've never seen that movie, Apollo 13, you should watch it because it's really well done. Very accurate, very well done. All right, so they're going towards the moon. And as they get close to the moon, right here, then they go into lunar orbit. So they come here and they burn their rocket again. They actually turn it around and slow themselves down till they get at the right speed. So then they're orbiting the moon. Then when they're orbiting the moon, they separate. They separate the lunar excursion module from the command module. The command module continues to orbit the moon. And so it stays up there, and one of the astronauts stays up there. And this is one of the things that always shows up as trivia questions. Everybody remembers Neil and Buzz walking on the moon, but they forget about the 3rd guy that's up there just floating around the moon by himself while they're down there getting all the glory. By the way, it was Michael Collins, if you're ever curious. He wrote a book about it, which was very good, called Carrying the Fire. But he was just sitting there orbiting the moon in the command module. The legs come out on this, like this. And this comes down to the surface, and it has one rocket, and it floats down through this thing. And you don't have to worry about all the stuff hanging out because there's no atmosphere. And it comes down, and then it lands on the surface.